Good afternoon, this is woodblock printmaker Dave Bull here at my carving bench in our shop in Asakusa, Tokyo. This is the second episode in what is going to be an ongoing series discussing our project to create new woodblock prints based on a collection of old Hokusai designs in the possession of the British Museum. The project we are calling Hokusai Reborn. If you haven't watched the previous episode yet, it wouldn't be a bad idea to do so, and you can find the link in the description below. Some years back, when I was creating our version of Hokusai's iconic Great Wave design, that video series ran to some 17 episodes, and actually it's probably not finished even now. Just how many episodes this project will take, I cannot yet see, but we'll take that as it comes. Let's just dig in. Now, too much talk without actually showing the process is not going to be so useful. So I've prepared what I hope will be useful. It's a stack of samples and illustrations to try and help with getting the explanation across. Now, there's no test at the end here, so let's just take it easy and explore these ideas together. Now, the sheets I have here, you saw these in the previous video, are mock-ups I have made of those Hokusai drawings in the museum collection. The curators over there are not about to let me fool around with the real drawings, of course, but they have sent me good quality images for this project, and I used that data to make these replicas on very thin, strong Gampi paper to help with my explanation here. Now, in this presentation, we are going to focus on the basic process of how traditional woodblock prints were prepared for production in Hokusai's day, in order to understand just what these sheets of paper are and how they were intended to be used. The first, and to my mind the most important thing to mention, is that the production of a traditional Japanese woodblock print, or book of prints, was a team effort. From speaking to visitors in our shop here in Asakusa over the years, I have learned that a great many people familiar with Western traditions, are under the impression that Hokusai was a printmaker, that he made prints himself. Now, he did no such thing. He never, and I mean absolutely never, touched the actual prints themselves. Putting pigment on the paper was the job of highly trained professional printers, and the same thing applied to the cutting of the woodblocks. All physical production work was done by professional specialists. The idea that a designer would ever be involved in the actual making of the prints would have been unthinkable in those days. Now, this team concept of printmaking has been widely known and understood for a long time, and we frequently see references to the ukiyo-e quartet, the four people doing the main jobs. Simply put, we have the publisher directing the overall process, a designer, of course, creating the image, a carver cutting the blocks, and a printer actually making the prints. Now, I said four people, but that's a simplification. For those last two stages, carving and printing, the work was done not by individuals, but by workshops. The top gun in a carver's shop might do the most critical parts of a block, the face or something, and other men and apprentices working on other areas. And in the case of printing, it was not uncommon, and we do this here sometimes, for key blocks, the most critical and difficult part of the job, to be printed by the most experienced worker, and the paper then being passed to other people for color printing. The overall goal always was to do any given job as quickly and efficiently as possible. Now, those parts of the process, the carving and printing, you've seen them in our videos time and time again. These are relatively easy to visualize, but it gets more difficult when we look at the earlier stages of the process, getting the image ready in the first place. Now, surely the design part of the job must be done by one person, the designer. Well, here again, yes and no. Pretty much all the main ukiyo-e designers worked together with other people. They had assistants, they had apprentices, or pupils even. Staggering numbers of these woodblock prints were published back in the day, and when we look at the quantities attributed to each of these top designers, it is clear, absolutely, that they could not possibly have done all that work by themselves. So when we are looking at a print nominally designed by Mr. X, It is very much an open question, and this very much applies to our Hokusai project here as to how much of it, if any, was actually done by the main man himself. Now there's a thought that we can tell by looking at the brush strokes. Isn't this Hokusai's actual brush strokes? This also isn't so easy. Remember, those apprentices started their training on the very first day by learning to imitate, and imitate exactly the brushstrokes of the teacher. That's why they were there, so that as they became fluent, they could produce work that perfectly reflected the style of the studio. Then on top of that, we have the fact that Hokusai's own style, of course, changed and evolved over the years, making it even more difficult to look at some line work and attribute it definitely to his brush. Now, honestly speaking, though, this really doesn't matter. That these images come from the Hokusai studio environment is undeniable, and it was very clearly a very ambitious project. Absolutely, Hokusai's hand must be all over these. But this brings us to a very important and almost totally unrecognized part of the production process. We've all read how it's supposed to work. The designer brushes the image onto thin paper, which then goes to the carver, who pastes it down on a fresh cherry plank and starts cutting. Actually, though, it wasn't anywhere near that simple. Even a genius-level artist like Hokusai didn't just sit down with a fresh sheet of paper and toss off a finished design. The process would begin with sketches, of course, which would then be worked over, edited, and remade as many times as necessary. And depending on the scale and scope of the project, the publisher would be involved in this process, giving his approval or not, as was required, in order that the design would properly fit within the overall concept of the proposed publication. Now, we of course don't have perfect documentation of this process showing every stage of some particular image from the earliest sketch up to the final publication. None of the people involved in this would have any thought that this sort of material should have been preserved at all. But we do have, here and there, in this museum and that, scraps and drawings that can be matched up to give us insights into the workflow. This is Jack Hillier's. Oh, just a minute. This is going to be chaos, this next little section, whatever. This is Jack Hillier's volume discussing Hokusai's book illustrations over the course of his career, and it contains some information very useful for us. In here we have, let's start with this illustration. Now, looking carefully, we can see faint lines in the background, clearly the initial roughing out of how the two characters would be positioned on the page. Then drawn directly on top of that, we have the stronger lines of the sketch itself. Now, this is a sketch. This is certainly not ready for carving as it stands. But this image did end up getting carved, because here Mr. Hillier is showing us the page from the finished book. Clean, sharp, wonderfully, delicately carved. But what happened in between these two stages? Okay, now to try and understand some of that process, let's take a look at some other drawings that have come down to us. I've got them in order here, and I'll try and get through this step by step logically. This one is not Hokusai, but Yoshitoshi, but it's the same concept. See the faint vermilion at the bottom? That's the rough sketch of the concept. And then again, right on the same sheet, the designer has used black ink to clean it up and make a much more presentable image. Now, this one is still too rough for carving, and it would certainly have been developed further, but before they moved on to that, somebody made some edits. Now, there's absolutely no way to erase ink lines for such thin paper, but look at this place here. Can you see what they've done? They've lightly pasted a small piece of thin paper at one place, and then simply drawn the fresh lines in the newly desired location. The old ones are hidden and the new ones are there. Now, this cut and paste technique was not just for correction, but for layout. Here's another old Hokusai drawing. This isn't from the British Museum, this is in the Smithsonian. And look here, the lady here. You can clearly see the difference in paper toning. This is a separate piece of paper. They've tried where to put her, and they've dropped her into place at that location. Now, going back to Hillier's book again, I've photocopied some of these so we can see all these things side by side. These are illustrations from Jack Hillary's book. Now here we are. Here's another sketch, and we can see faintly under there traces of that original drawing. And then with a brush, carefully worked out more drawing. Now take a look at the pattern here on the clothing. It's drawn only once. Now this could well be Hokusai's work, but it seems very clear that this is as far as Hokusai needed to go. From this point, it would be handed to a copyist for completion. Now that person may have been one of his apprentices, perhaps it was a specialist working for the publisher. Now we don't have the next in-between sheet, it would have gone to the block cutter and been destroyed, but we do have again the finished book page. Look at it, the design has been tightened up and the kimono pattern has been replicated to other locations on the fabric. Going back now, it would have been a complete, total waste of time for Hokusai to do all that, but it was just part of the jobs for the assistant. So bit by bit, through tracing, moving, pasting over, redrawing, copy and paste, the image gradually comes into the desired form. What form? Now, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston has a wonderful collection of Hokusai designs that would clearly seem to be that missing link, the final stage ready for cutting. The image is present, the borders are present, the title of the book is present, and there would be no need for those things to be present in preparatory versions. The lines of the main character here are beautifully sharp and clear. The dragon is perfectly delineated, and there is even a note up at the top here with instructions to the carver on how to handle some of these scattered dots in the sky. Now, all of this preparatory work done by Hokusai himself, not a chance. Mr. Hillier himself talks about this in the text. This filling out, given a hint by the artist, would be exactly within the competence of the skilled copyists who abounded at the time. Okay, now coming back to our own project, the Hokusai drawings in the British Museum. What stage in this complex process do these represent? Are these the final block copies ready for cutting, or are they still at an earlier stage? We have evidence here for both sides. Let's try and make that determination. Now, at the time of making this video, I myself have already carved and finished the first print. Here's an enlargement of the drawing, and my print is here somewhere in front of it. Now I have to say, when I was presented with this face to carve, the situation I felt was very clear to me. No way is this block ready. Now back in the day, were the carvers really so good that they could create a perfect Hokusai nose from that blurred mess? Let's take some of the other ones. This is print number 3 in our selection. It's going to be coming out next month. Look at this, the edges of this straw mat being held by fingers. Or down here, these indistinct patterns on this clothing. If we take this drawing to be block copy, it seems to me that the carvers are being asked to make up an awful lot of this as they go along. Now, having said that, though, it can be argued that there is evidence for the other side, that they are block copies. Let's return for a moment. Oh, I'm supposed to find 5 and 6. Here we are. Let's return for a moment to these pair we looked at a minute ago. In the preparatory sketch, there are no borders or page numbers, nothing. The design team has no idea where such things are going to go. Those things are present in the book, of course, and they must have been drawn onto the block copy. Okay, let's take a look at this one, and there are more showing the same thing. This one from the British Museum. Now, these have been treated badly by some previous collector. Somebody's taken scissors and trimmed them right up to the image, then pasted them on card. But here and there, you can see traces of borderlines. And as we have seen, the very presence of borderlines on one of these implies that these are at the stage to be passed to the carver. So for us, my team, what to do with the project this year? Just paste them down and get going? The 3 of us who are going to be doing the carving work on this series spent hour after hour in group meetings at the beginning of this, going over these images, trying to decide what approach to take. And we decided in the interest of having the designs cut as cleanly as possible, to take the time and trouble to retrace everything ourselves. Now this takes an insanely long time, going over every single line and dot, but it has a couple of very great advantages for us. One is that the tracing is a process that can be studied, taken slowly, discussed, and with liberal use of an undo button, we can rework it all until we get it perfect. Then, with that perfectly sharp and clear tracing down on the wood, the carving moves forward with much, much more confidence. We can see what to cut, just get down and do it. Now the two prints we've completed so far, I've lost the other one, it doesn't matter. The two prints we've completed so far have, I think, come out pretty well. When we put them side by side with the drawings, I feel that our work clearly honors the intent of the originals. And especially in this second one, our carver has done a wonderful job of expressing the wide variety of possible textures and tones suggested by the designer. Now, before I close this discussion off, there's another major issue in traditional Japanese print production that I need to touch on. When we look back over Hokusai's output of books, we find items at quite different levels of publishing complexity. Some are simple. Black and white books is another picture of that one I just showed you a minute ago. Others, like the famous Hokusai manga, have a few tint blocks. There's a gray and a peach block there to add interest. His masterwork, 100 Views of Mount Fuji, uses a number of color blocks, but all printed in tones and shades of gray. And still other books were printed in full color format with an extensive palette. These would have been much more expensive in the marketplace. Okay, how about our set of drawings? Can we tell from these what format was intended? Now that's a tough call. For all of those publishing options that I outlined, the start point would have been the same, cutting a block for the main lines of the design. It seems a bit difficult to believe, but at no point in the preparation of traditional Japanese prints was there ever a fully worked out master copy with lines and colorations. The designer never prepared a fully rendered painting to be handed in for production as a print. No matter which of those levels of production was intended, it all started with the line drawing, just like our British Museum images. Whether or not color blocks were intended to follow was of no consequence at that point. Only once the key block was finished could color separation be done, if indeed it was intended. So, given that our drawings don't give us any information about potential coloring, we need to consider the overall concept of the publishing project. When you look at the images in total, it's the British Museum Group, along with some very similar drawings in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. They have another bunch, they have more than the British Museum does. It's clear that these are all part of the same overall large publishing project. The format it's encyclopedic. Everything in there is pictured and labeled. And it seems clear that the intent was not so much an artistic production as an informative production. It was literally an encyclopedia. So I think that for that sort of publication, a simple rendering in black and white or a very limited palette of tints would suffice. I don't believe we need to think about colorizing the prints we will be making this year. But having said that, what's this? Here and there in all of these sketches, there are indications that a gray tone seems to be intended to be printed. Now, it might seem like that to a casual observer, but actually no. These gray tones are nothing to do with an intention of making gray tone blocks. They are indicators to the carver, and stick with me on this, they're indicators to the carver that such areas should be left as solid black. Let's move ahead to an example of a finished print, again from the 100 Views of Fuji. Look at the legs here, the kimono here, where wood has been left to print as black, but the carver has very slightly cut a fine white line to indicate the shape of the original brush lines. The original block copy for this would have had those areas tinted in gray. Why grey? Why not tint them in solid black? It's just too difficult for the man with the brush to leave that tiny thin gap at the edge of the line and the black inside. Far easier just to draw the lines cleanly and clearly, then throw in a grey tint to communicate the intent to the carver. He would know what to do. So there we have it, a basic outline of just what these museum drawings are and how they were intended to be used. Now this preparation story is actually far from over, and in the next video I will dig a little bit deeper and discuss why this particular project is such a wonderful and nearly unique opportunity for our carving team. I feel a bit sad though that this has just been all talk, talk, talk and no real work. So to close off, I'm going to give you some B-roll, video snippets taken while I was working on the first print. A bit of tracing, a bit of carving, and a bit of printing. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Through all the early decades of my printmaking activities, I did the tracing work in the only way then possible, by using thin paper on top of an enlarged master copy, working over a light table. The job got done, frequently with a liberal use of pasted-on corrections, and I had no complaints. But once these new tools became available and affordable, there was no going back. I can scale to a convenient size for working, I can adjust thickness and opacity of the lines, and most wonderfully of all, I have an undo button. The quality of the output is far higher than what I was able to create with pen on paper. You can see the method I'm using. There are 3 layers involved. The original image is at the bottom of the stack, with the trace layer at the top. In between the two is a blank white layer, which I turn on occasionally to hide the master, so that I can make adjustments and refinements to the tracing. I do this by gently brushing more width to the lines, and also by switching to eraser mode and shaving off as required. The trace layer is set to an opacity of around 50%, letting me see the shapes underneath as I am working. And the use of a red tone also helps distinguish my drawn lines from the master. Once all is done and I'm ready to output the file, I will increase that opacity to 100% and transform it to black. A truly expert calligrapher would not work the way I am doing, using small, short strokes to replicate the overall shape of each line. But this allows me to make endless variation in the lines, cleaning where needs be and filling in where necessary. That master calligrapher could perhaps do each line of this dragon's claw in one stroke, but I think the result would end up with more of his taste than Hokusai's. Remember also that we are working here at a greatly enlarged scale, and by the time this is shrunk back down to the original dimensions, much of this detail will actually be lost. Back in the earlier section of this video, I think I said, when we put our prints side by side with the drawings, I feel that our work clearly honors the intent of the originals. Well, let's have a look. Let me fade back and forth here between the two, and you can decide for yourself. And here we are with the entire design ready for output onto thin Gambi paper to be passed to the carver. In this case, with the carver being the same person who did the tracing, me of course, he has a real head start on the work, knowing exactly now what needs to be done. This is our standard method for the next step. Gampi paper lightly tacked to a stiffer backing sheet. After pasting down with the backing sheet discarded, more than half of the gampi itself can be peeled away, leaving a beautifully clean and clear image on the book. Some of these next clips are taken from our live Twitch streams. I usually use 3 cameras to give people a chance to feel what it is like to be here in Asakusa. In the next few clips, you'll see the weather change in the street view at the lower left corner. Our stream normally goes live at 8 a.m. Tokyo time, so most of the people you see going by outside are on their way to work or school. There is also a live chat with each stream, allowing me to communicate back and forth with the viewers, but that does not show in this archival view. How did you spend your Monday? Oh, I don't know. I carved a bunch of dragon whiskers. Nothing much. The usual. So there we have it, the key block finished. I hadn't mentioned it earlier, but for this series we are cutting the key blocks on boxwood rather than the traditional cherry. It's much harder, and we expect these to last for a very, very long time. This initial test printing is happening at my carving bench, not up in the printing room. The idea is to pull a quick proof and then make adjustments to the carving as required before moving ahead with the next stage. Okay, this is not deep rich black, this is just a thin film here. Another Twitch stream view. I never really understand this. Upwards of 500, 600, 700 people will happily sit there chatting with each other while they watch me put glue on paper. And now for some printing clips. I didn't show you the process of carving the two color blocks for this design. This one makes liberal use of the itabokashi technique, shaving off some of the sharp edges to give a blurred effect to the edge of these clouds. Longtime viewers of these streams recognize that this is not my own printing station. I am a lefty, and as the workstations here in Asakusa are all designed for use by right-handers, everything is on the wrong side. Those same longtime viewers will also see something a bit strange here. I'm doing the key block last. It always goes first. I'm doing it at the end here because I didn't want to have any bleeding of the key lines when printing those gray tones. And as there is no supercritical registration of many colors involved here, there isn't much risk in doing it backwards. The final impression is the embossing of the carver and printer names, both the same in this case. And here we are. Just how closely it matches the original publisher's intentions, we will never know. But it's a fine looking print in any case. So that this has been all talk and no real work. So to close off this video presentation, I'm going to dig up some B-roll. Video snippets taken while I was working on the first print. We'll see a bit of tracing, a bit of carving, and a bit of printing. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Okay. Well, that's